My daughter's hospital bed. The doctor whispered. She wasn't in an accident. My hands froze. What do you mean? He hesitated. Someone did this to her, intentionally. Then my phone buzzed. My wife. Don't ask questions. Just come home. I didn't go home. I went to the security office, and what I saw on the footage broke me. But before I begin, please like and subscribe to the channel. And we'd love to hear which part of the world are you joining us from. Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. The emergency room at St. Vincent Medical Center in Toledo, Ohio, smelled the way all hospitals smell after midnight. Antiseptic layered over the stale bitterness of coffee that had been sitting on a warming plate far too long. The fluorescent lights ran low and constant overhead, casting a flat, shadowless light that made everyone look a little worse than they were. Somewhere down the corridor, a child was crying quietly, and a nurse moved past the waiting room in rubber-soled shoes without looking up. Nobody looked up in places like this. Everyone was busy carrying something too heavy to share. Thomas Weller had driven here directly from a job site on the east side of town. He was still wearing his work boots, the steel-toed ones he wore every day without exception. They were scuffed and salt-stained and laced in a knot he had tied without thinking that same morning while the coffee brewed. There was joint compound dust on the back of his jeans and a smear of grease near his left wrist that he had wiped it twice on the drive over and still had not managed to get off. He had not stopped at home to clean up when his phone rang and he heard the words, "Ava has been taken to St. Vincent. Your wife is already en route." He had walked off the job site without a word to anyone, gotten into his truck, and driven straight here. That was the kind of man he was. Quiet, direct, no drama. He had always been that way. Not because he was emotionally distant, but because he had grown up watching his father move through hard things without making a performance of them, and the lesson had settled deep. You handled what needed to be handled. You kept your panic to yourself. You showed up. He stood now beside Ava's bed in a curtained bay near the end of the hall. His 12-year-old daughter lay under a thin blanket, one arm wrapped in a fresh cast from her wrist to just below her elbow. Her left cheek was swollen and mottled, yellow-purple at the high edge, darker near the cheekbone, and one of her eyes was puffy at the outer corner. There was a small cut above her brow that had been cleaned and taped with 2 strips of white medical tape that stood out against her skin. She was unconscious, and the difference between unconscious and asleep was visible if you knew what to look for. Her face was too slack. Her breathing was too shallow and measured, like a metronome set just barely above stillness. Thomas had stared at her for a long time before the doctor came in. He had stood beside the bed with his hands at his sides and his jaw set, and he had looked at his daughter's face and not let himself do anything with what he felt. Not yet. Dr. Leonard Gaines was a heavy-set man in his mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up on his head and the careful, practiced calm of someone who delivered difficult news regularly and had long ago made his peace with the fact that it never got easier. He pulled the curtain closed behind him and glanced at the tablet in his hand before setting it on the bed rail and folding his hands in front of him. "Mr. Weller." His voice was measured. "I want to go over what we're seeing with Ava tonight." "Go ahead," Thomas said. He did not move away from the bed. Dr. Gaines looked at him directly, the look of a man deciding how much plain language a person can handle, and deciding the answer was all of it. "Ava has a hairline fracture in her ulna, the forearm bone. The cast will be on for 4 to 6 weeks. The swelling you're seeing on her face is consistent with direct blunt trauma, meaning something hard made contact with her cheekbone at a significant angle. There's also bruising along her left shoulder that tells us she was grabbed, probably hard enough to hold her in place while the other injury occurred." He paused. "These injuries are not consistent with a fall down a staircase." Thomas looked at him. "That's what my wife told the dispatch operator, that she fell." "I know. I've read the report." The doctor's tone did not waver. "But the fracture pattern in the forearm, the way the bone cracked, indicates the arm was bent or twisted with significant force from outside. And the facial impact is direct and frontal, not the kind of angle you see when someone pitches forward on stairs. Stairs tend to give you hands, knees, foreheads. What I'm seeing tonight is different." He let that land for a moment. "Someone hurt her, Mr. Weller, or she was grabbed, restrained, and struck something hard. Either way, this was not an accident." Thomas said nothing. He stood very still. He was aware of his own heartbeat in a way he rarely was, slow, steady, each beat deliberate like something counting down. "We're required by law to file a report with Child Protective Services in cases where the injury pattern is inconsistent with a reported account," Dr. Gaines continued. "An investigator will want to speak with both you and your wife. I want you to know that before you leave tonight." Another pause. Is there anything you can tell me about what might have happened? No, Thomas said. It was not quite a lie. He had no name yet. He had no picture yet. He only had the first cold, hard edge of something he could not yet see the full shape of. The way you know there's a wall in the dark before you touch it, from the particular quality of the silence on the other side. His phone buzzed against his thigh. He pulled it out. A message from Nina. Don't talk to anyone. Come home. Now. He read it once. He read it again. He read it a third time, slowly, the way you read something when you're testing whether the words mean what they appear to mean. Not, how is she? Not, is Ava okay? Not, I'm driving back now. Not, I love you both, I'm so scared. Don't talk to anyone. Come home. Now. Thomas kept his face even. He put the phone back in his pocket. He thanked Dr. Gaines, waited until the man had stepped out past the curtain, and then he turned back to his daughter. He looked at the cast. He looked at the bruise. He looked at the slight tremble in her lower lip, even while she was out cold, like her body was still flinching from something her mind had not yet released. I'll be back, he said quietly. He walked out of the hospital and stood in the parking lot in the October air. It was cold and damp, the kind of cold that settles in the back of the throat, and the streetlights made pale halos in the mist coming off the Maumee. A few cars moved past on the main road. Somewhere in the middle distance, a truck aired its brakes on the overpass with a long, hissing exhale. He stood there without moving for a very long time. Not pacing, not fidgeting, just standing, because there were thoughts that needed to run their full course before you moved, and he had learned that the hard way. Rush a thought, and you get a rough edge. Let it run, and it comes out clean. When he finally got into his truck, he sat behind the wheel for another few minutes before starting the engine. He was thinking about the words, come home. Now, that was a woman managing a situation, not grieving, managing. The engine turned over. He pulled out of the parking lot. He drove. The drive home took 11 minutes. He knew the route, the way you know a song you've heard 1,000 times, without thinking, each turn arriving exactly when it should. He had driven this road in the rain, in the dark, after long days and early mornings. He knew the dip near the Carver Street overpass and the way the trees on Ellsworth closed over the road in summer and the particular patch of rough asphalt just before his block that made his front left tire knock if he hit it at speed. He had driven it for 8 years. It had never felt as long as it did tonight. He parked in the driveway and sat with the engine off. The kitchen light was on. The rest of the house was dark. The porch light was off. He went in through the side door. Nina was standing at the kitchen sink with her arms crossed, facing the window over the backyard. She was wearing jeans and a dark zip-up jacket. Her dark hair was pulled back tight. Not the loose way she usually wore at home, but pulled back with the kind of care that meant she had retied it deliberately, which meant she had been doing something, moving around, and had put herself together before he arrived. She had changed since this morning. He noticed that. She didn't turn when he came in. She heard the door. He knew she heard it, but she stayed where she was until he had set his keys on the counter and the silence had gone on long enough to be a statement. You talked to the doctor, she said. It was not a question. Yes. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car rolled past on the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the kitchen window. She fell, Nina said. Too quickly. The words had been waiting. Thomas kept his voice even. Ow! She tripped. On the top step. I told the dispatch operator the same thing. Which step? What? Which step exactly? Nina turned from the window. The third one from the top. She was in socks. You know how the wood gets slippery near the banister. She uncrossed her arms. Why are you interrogating me? Thomas heard that word and let it sit in the room. Interrogating. Not worried. Not trying to explain what happened to their daughter. Not frightened by the way he was asking. Interrogating. Like she already had a story she was defending and the problem was his tone rather than the facts. He didn't say any of that. He nodded slowly and let his eyes move around the room at their own pace. At first glance, the kitchen looked ordinary. Dinner dishes still in the drying rack. The window above the sink fogged slightly from the heat inside, meeting the cold glass. Mail on the counter in a small pile. The kind of domestic still life that a house produces naturally, without effort. But Thomas was a man who worked with his hands and lived in close attention to the physical world, and men like that notice details. The picture on the wall beside the hallway door, a framed photo of the three of them at Put-in Bay, a trip they had taken 3 summers ago when Ava was 9, all 3 of them sunburned and grinning, was sitting crooked. The left side had dropped 2 or 3 inches below level. Thomas had straightened that picture just last week. He knew because it had been bothering him for days before he finally fixed it, and he remembered reaching up and adjusting it while Nina was on the phone with her mother. It had been straight this morning. He was certain. There was also a piece of broken glass in the trash can near the back door. Not at the bottom of the can, where something would land if it had broken and been swept up in the normal course of the day. It was sitting right on top, dropped there carelessly, recently. A curved piece of glass with a faint painted design on it. It was from a picture frame. Not a large frame, a small one. And the chair at the end of the kitchen table, the one closest to the hallway entrance, had been pushed back further than usual, its back angled away from the table, as though someone had stood up from it suddenly and not pushed it in afterward. None of those things were proof of anything by themselves. Together, they were sentence. The doctor is required to file a report, Thomas said, with Child Protective Services. Someone will come to speak with us, probably within a few days. Nina's jaw tightened just slightly. Fine. They'll probably want to see the house. Look at the staircase. Fine, Thomas. He watched her for a moment. She was controlled, almost perfectly controlled, the kind of control that you maintain through effort, not by nature. Her hands were still. Her face was composed. Her 12-year-old daughter was unconscious in a hospital bed with a fractured arm and a bruised cheekbone, and there was no moisture in Nina's eyes, no tremble in her voice, no evidence of the terror that should have been there. He had been married to this woman for 11 years. He had seen her cry at movies and at funerals, and once, memorably, at a news story about a dog that had been rescued from a frozen river 3 states away. He knew her face in grief. He was not looking at it now. He picked up his keys. I'm going back to the hospital. You need to sleep. You've been on the job site since 6 this morning. I'm going back to the hospital, he said again, without a shift in his voice. He went out the side door. He did not slam it. He pulled it quietly closed behind him and walked to his truck in the dark and got in. He sat there a moment before turning the key. In 16 years of knowing Nina Weller, he had never once been afraid of her. He had been frustrated by her, exasperated by her, sometimes deeply disappointed by her in the small, ordinary ways of marriage. But he had never been afraid. He was not afraid now, exactly. But he was paying attention in a way he had never paid attention before. He went back to St. Vincent and sat with Ava for 2 hours. She didn't wake up. A nurse came in at 9:30 and checked her vitals and told Thomas in a patient voice that the sedation from the procedure was still working its way out of her system, that she was stable, that she would likely be more alert by morning. Thomas thanked her and sat back down and looked at his daughter's face and thought about nothing specific. Just let his mind rest on the facts, the way you rest a load on a flat surface while you figure out where it needs to go. He drove home after midnight. The streets were empty at that hour, the traffic signals blinking yellow at the main intersections, the storefronts dark. The mist had thickened and the stoplights made blurred smears of red and green ahead of him, the whole city looking soft and uncertain through the wet air. He parked in the driveway and did not go inside. He cut the engine and put the seat back a half inch and sat in the dark cab watching the front of the house through the windshield. The kitchen light was off. The bedroom window was dark. The porch light was still off. The whole house looked still and quiet and completely ordinary, the way it looked on any night when nothing at all was wrong. Around 12:40, the front door opened. Nina came out in the same dark jacket. She moved carefully, pulling the door shut behind her with a practiced slowness. Not the way you close a door in your own home, but the way you close it when you're trying not to make noise. She came down the porch steps with her head slightly lowered and walked with purpose toward the street without looking back and without looking toward the driveway. She did not check for his truck. That told him something. She walked to the end of the block and stopped at the corner under the streetlight, her hands in her pockets. Thomas sat still. 2 minutes passed. Then a pickup truck rolled up the street and stopped at the corner. Dark blue, a few years old, a small crumple in the rear wheel well on the passenger side that caught the streetlight at a particular angle. The driver's window was down a few inches. Thomas recognized that truck. He recognized it the way you recognize a thing you have seen before without fully registering it. Filed away, stored in some back room of memory, without a label. A truck parked outside the Sunoco on Bancroft on a Sunday morning when he had gone for gas. A truck idling in the parking lot at the rec center the night of one of Ava's swim meets, engine running, nobody visible inside. A truck on a side street near the hardware store maybe 6 weeks ago, facing the wrong direction for traffic as though it had turned around to watch something. Each of those images came back to him now with sudden clarity, like lights clicking on in a series of rooms. Paul Rourke. Thomas knew Paul Rourke the way people in old neighborhoods know names without ever having chosen to learn them. Rourke was a few years younger than Thomas, broad across the shoulders, the kind of man who always seemed to be standing in doorways at bars or leaning against walls at neighborhood events, watching the room from a comfortable distance. He had a landscaping business that some people on the block used occasionally, and some people had quietly stopped using without quite explaining why. There were stories about him that moved through the neighborhood in the low, indirect way that stories move in places where people have known each other too long to say things directly. Car debts. A check at the hardware store that had come back wrong. A legal matter in Rossford 2 years ago involving a woman who had eventually, somehow, dropped the complaint. Thomas had had no particular feeling about Paul Rourke before tonight. He watched Nina get into the passenger seat. He watched the door close. He watched the truck pull away from the curb with its headlights on, rolling quietly down the empty street. Thomas counted to 30. Then he started his engine and followed. He kept 3 blocks of distance. No headlights for the first stretch. Then on once they reached the main road where other traffic provided cover. He had run surveillance routes before without knowing that was what they were called. Following a subcontractor he suspected of taking materials off a site, tracking a delivery that kept coming up short on inventory. He had always been methodical, patient. He moved through the world at the pace things required and not a moment faster. They drove for about 20 minutes, heading south of the main city grid, the streetlights thinning and the commercial strips giving way to older neighborhoods, and then to a stretch of State Route 25 lined with gas stations and motels and the kind of businesses that operate in the hours when most people are asleep. The truck pulled into the parking lot of a low-slung motel with exterior doors and a small office at one end and a neon vacancy sign in orange that buzzed visibly even from the road. Thomas parked on a shoulder 100 yards back with his lights off. He watched Paul Rourke get out of the truck and walk around the front of it to open Nina's door, a small, reflexive gesture, the kind that comes from repetition. The kind you do without thinking because you've done it many times before. He watched them go inside room 7. The light came on behind the curtain. The parking lot went quiet. Thomas sat in the dark for a long time after the door closed. He was not shaking. He was not crying. He was not filled with rage in the way people imagined rage worked. Red at the edges of the vision, chest tight, hands ready to move. He had always been suspicious of that kind of rage. It was a luxury. It required a person to stop thinking, and he was not willing to stop thinking. What he felt, sitting in his truck outside a motel off Route 25 at 1 in the morning, was something colder than rage. Something that had weight to it, like concrete setting, like a level held against a wall, perfectly still, perfectly true, reading something that could not be argued with. He drove home. He went inside. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark without turning on a light and thought through it all. The hospital, the doctor's words, Nina's message, the picture frame, the broken glass, the chair pushed out of place, the motel room, the name Paul Rourke, and he thought through all of it with the same steadiness he brought to any complicated problem. Slowly, one piece at a time, testing each connection before he moved to the next. By the time the sky began to go gray at the edges, he had worked through the initial shock and moved past it into something cleaner. The shock was useful for one thing. It made you feel the reality of a situation. Once you had felt it, you could set it aside and work. He knew now, with complete certainty, that what had happened to Ava was not an accident. He knew that it was connected to whatever was happening between Nina and Paul Rourke. And he knew, with the cold clarity of a man who builds things and therefore understands the way structures fail, that this particular structure, whatever Nina and Paul were building, was aimed at him. He just needed the full picture before he moved. He always needed the full picture. Ava woke up at 8:30 the following morning. Thomas had gone home at 5, showered in the guest bathroom, changed into clean clothes, and driven back to St. Vincent before the morning shift change. He had picked up a coffee from the cart in the lobby and had been sitting in the chair beside Ava's bed for nearly an hour, reading nothing, thinking slowly, when her eyes opened and found the ceiling and then, after a moment of quiet adjustment, found him. Dad. Her voice was rough from sleep and the dry hospital air. Right here. He leaned forward and put his hand over hers where it lay above the blanket. She looked at the curtain, then at the 4-line running into her arm, then at the cast. He watched her mind assemble the previous day in sequence, the pieces coming back one at a time, each one landing with a different weight. When the full sequence completed, her face changed. Not fear exactly, but something careful, guarded. How do you feel? He asked. My arm hurts. And my face. She reached up carefully with her right hand and touched her cheek, then pulled the hand back. The swelling will go down. The doctor says the arm will heal clean. He kept his voice steady. You're going to be okay. She nodded. She lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling. Dad. Her voice had changed. Quieter, with something underneath it, something that had been waiting. I'm right here, Ava. She turned her head and looked at him. Her eyes were very steady for a 12-year-old lying in a hospital bed, more steady than he would have expected, and it occurred to him that she had probably been awake for some of the night, thinking through what she was going to say. I saw Mom. With him. Thomas kept his hand over hers. He kept his face still. Who? That man. Paul. The one with the blue truck. She swallowed carefully. He comes over sometimes when you're at work. Mom always tells me to go to my room when he's there. But yesterday I came downstairs because I left my phone charger in the kitchen and I forgot she had company. She paused. They were in the kitchen. Fighting. What were they fighting about? I don't know exactly. I only caught part of it before they noticed me. Something about money. He was saying something about a timeline, and Mom was saying to keep his voice down. Her voice thinned, the edges of it going unsteady. And then he saw me standing in the doorway. He gave Mom this look, like I was a problem. Thomas waited. He did not rush her. I said I was going to tell you what I saw. Ava's chin trembled once, then steadied itself with a visible effort. I told Mom right in front of him that I was going to tell you he was coming over. And he grabbed my arm, really hard. I tried to pull away, and I stumbled into the wall, and then I don't really remember the rest of it. It happened fast, and I was on the floor, and my arm hurt, and I was dizzy. She paused, and then I woke up here. Thomas closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. When he opened them, his face was the same as it had been. Did your mom try to stop him? He asked carefully. Ava did not answer right away. The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer, but he waited anyway. She said stop. Ava said finally. She told him to stop. But then, after, she didn't come to me. She looked at the ceiling. She stayed near him. And when the ambulance people came, she told them I fell down the stairs. I know, Thomas said. I didn't fall. I know that. He squeezed her hand once, gently. You did exactly the right thing telling me. You did the right thing all the way through, Ava. I want you to understand that. She looked at him with those careful eyes. Is Mom going to be in trouble? I'm going to handle it, he said. That's the only thing that matters right now. I'm going to handle it. He stayed until the morning nurse came in for rounds, and then excused himself and walked down the corridor to the window, at the far end, the one that looked out over the city. The October sky was low and white, the kind of white that holds rain. He could see the rooftops stretching south toward the river, a church steeple in the middle distance, the elevated section of I-75 just visible at the edge of the view. Toledo in the morning, gray and steady and working. He stood there for a while and let the full weight of what Ava had told him settle without trying to shape it into anything yet. Paul Rourke had been in his house. Repeatedly. Nina had known and had arranged it. Ava had witnessed something, had threatened to tell, and Rourke had responded with violence. Nina had stood there and allowed it. And then she had coached her own daughter to lie. He thought about the message again. Don't talk to anyone. Come home. Now. She had not been protecting Ava from embarrassment or protecting the marriage from exposure. She had been protecting the operation. Whatever she and Rourke were building together, Ava's seeing it had been a threat, and the response to that threat had been calculated and immediate. Thomas walked back down the corridor and sat in the chair beside his daughter's bed and looked at her face and began, with great care and patience, to think. He did not confront Nina. Not yet. Not until he had the complete picture. He had learned this the hard way over 20 years of managing construction projects, subcontractors, supply chains, budgets that never worked out exactly as planned, and clients who always wanted more than they were paying for. The most expensive mistake a builder could make was starting work before you understood the full scope of the job. You pick up a wall without knowing what's in it, and you might hit a load-bearing beam or a live wire or a gas line. You have to look first. Always. He called in sick to the job site. He told his foreman there was a family emergency, which was accurate enough to require no elaboration. And then he spent the next day and a half moving quietly through the parts of Toledo where information lived, not in dramatic ways, not in ways that would raise flags or trigger conversations. He moved the way he always moved, steadily, without drawing attention, asking just enough to get the next piece and no more. He knew people. He had grown up in the city and spent 2 decades working in it. And the thing about working in a place for 20 years is that you accumulate a map of it that no official document ever captures. You know which contractors are reliable and which ones will short you on materials. You know whose brother worked for which crew before things went legit. You know the woman at the title company who will explain something off the record over coffee because she knows you and trusts you and because the official channels would take 6 weeks. He used all of that now. He got coffee at a diner on Monroe Street where a man named Roy, who had done drywall for Thomas for 3 years running, came in most mornings around 9. Thomas mentioned Paul Rourke's name once, casual as weather, and watched Roy's face. Roy set down his mug and looked at the table. That guy owes people serious money, he said. Card games, mostly, but some of it heavier than cards. How heavy? The kind of heavy where the people he owes don't send letters. Roy picked up his mug. Why are you asking? Something came up, Thomas said. I just want to understand who I'm dealing with. Roy looked at him for a moment with the look of a man who has known someone long enough to read the spaces between their words. Be careful, Tom. I always am. He spent an hour on the phone with a contact at the county clerk's office, asking about public filings under Paul Rourke's name and the name of his landscaping business. There were 3 civil suits in the past 4 years, 2 of them for unpaid debts, 1 from a former employee, a lien against his business property, a dismissed motion for a protective order from a Rossford address in 2021. The picture that assembled itself from these details was not complicated. Rourke was a man in serious financial trouble, the kind that was not going to be solved by trimming hedges and mowing lawns. Then Thomas called Diane at the insurance brokerage on Central Avenue. He had known Diane for 8 years. She had handled the insurance on 3 of his job sites and on his home and vehicle policy, and there was a professional trust between them built of small, reliable transactions and nothing more dramatic than that. He said he wanted to go over the household policy and make sure everything was current, and he mentioned, almost in passing, the life insurance. Diane was quiet on the other end of the line. Well, she said, choosing her words. Nina came in about 6 weeks ago. She made some updates. Thomas kept his voice flat. What kind of updates? She added a new term policy. On you specifically. A pause. It's a fairly substantial policy, Tom. I assumed you were aware of it. I have her signature on all the documentation. How substantial? Diane told him a number. He thanked her and ended the call and set his phone face down on the seat of his truck and sat looking through the windshield at the brick wall of the building across the street. An old warehouse, converted into something else now, the loading dock bricked over, a new set of windows cut into the upper floor. He had driven past that building for years without looking at it. He looked at it now, for a long time. The affair he had already processed. The lies he had already moved through. The injury to Ava was a wound he would carry for the rest of his life, but he had already converted the shock of it into something useful. He did what he always did with pain, acknowledged it, set it to one side, kept working. But this was different. This was not the impulsive destruction of a bad marriage. This was not someone caught in something and trying to cover it up. This was planning. This was a woman who had sat down in an insurance office 6 weeks ago and signed documentation for a policy specifically designed to pay out in the event of her husband's death. 6 weeks ago, before Ava saw anything, before the emergency room, before any of this had surfaced. The timeline made everything clear. This had been in motion for a long time. He thought about Rourke's debts. He thought about the motel room. He thought about the message, don't talk to anyone. He thought about the way Nina had said the word interrogating, not defensively, but strategically, try to make his questions the problem rather than her answers. He thought about what Roy had said, the kind of heavy where the people he owes don't send letters. And he thought, Paul Rourke needed money badly and quickly. Nina needed out of a marriage and access to a large payout. Together, they had been building something. Ava had been an accident of timing, wrong place, wrong moment. And Rourke had handled the complication the way a man handles complications when he is desperate and has stopped thinking clearly. With his hands. They were not just having an affair. They were planning his death. That evening, Thomas cooked dinner. He made pasta and a jar sauce from the cabinet. The simple kind, the kind he made on evenings when he was tired or didn't want to think about food. He set 2 plates at the kitchen table. He filled 2 glasses of water. He sat down and waited. Nina came in from the other room. She looked at the table, then at him, and he could see the small, rapid calculation happening behind her eyes. She was reading the room. Reading him, trying to determine what he knew and how much and in what order. She sat down. Ava is doing better, Thomas said, twisting pasta onto his fork. Nurse called this afternoon. They're talking about releasing her in a day or 2. Good, Nina said. They ate in the particular silence of a house where too many things have been withheld for too long. The kind of silence that has texture to it. Thomas ate steadily. He could feel Nina watching him between bites. That careful, monitoring gaze he had been on the receiving end of for days now, still pretending it wasn't there. I've been thinking about money, he said eventually. He let his voice carry the weight of a tired man, making a practical admission. Been running the numbers this week. We're more stretched than I thought. Maybe it's time to make some real changes. Cash out some of the insurance options, restructure things. I'll call the broker at the end of the week. Nina looked at him across the table. It was very brief. A flicker. The way a pilot light catches for just a second before the full flame takes hold. Her eyes sharpened. Not dramatically. Not enough that anyone who didn't know her as well as Thomas did would have caught it. And her chin moved a fraction forward, and he saw something that was unmistakably, viscerally, interest. Then she smoothed it over and looked down at her plate. That might not be the worst idea, she said. Careful. Even. I'll make some calls this week, Thomas said. Okay. Yeah. She pushed the pasta around her plate. He watched without watching. The peripheral surveillance of a man who had spent 20 years reading job sites, reading crews, reading the small physical tells of people who were about to do something they weren't supposed to do. Nina was not present at this table. She was somewhere else in her mind, working through something. The meal had given her information, and she was running it. He had given her exactly what he wanted to give her. A signal, an opening, a reason to accelerate whatever she and Rourke were already planning, because now the window was narrowing. The insurance was going to be restructured, and if they were going to use it, they would need to move. He cleared the plates. He washed them by hand the way he always did. He said goodnight and went to the bedroom and lay on top of the covers fully dressed, lights off, staring at the ceiling in the dark. He waited. 40 minutes later, he heard her footsteps in the hallway, quiet and deliberate, passing his door without pausing. He heard the soft click of the front latch. He heard, distantly, the sound of the blue truck pulling away down the street. He gave it 3 minutes. Then he picked up his phone and called Detective Frank Albury. Albury was the name on a card that Thomas had been carrying in his wallet for 3 years. A man he had met once at a neighborhood association meeting, a lean, quiet detective with a firm handshake who had given Thomas his card during a discussion about a string of tool thefts in the area. Thomas had kept the card because he kept everything that might be useful. He had never used it before tonight. It was past 10. Albury picked up on the third ring. This is Thomas Weller. We met at a neighborhood association meeting 3 years ago. I need you to listen to me very carefully. He spoke for 12 minutes without stopping. He started with Ava in the hospital and moved through every piece in chronological order. What the doctor said, what Nina's message said, what he'd seen in the house that night, the motel on Route 25, the name Paul Rourke, Rourke's debts, the insurance policy, Ava's account of the kitchen, the dinner conversation that evening. He gave Albury the name of his insurance contact. He offered to share the text message screenshots he had taken. He did not shout. He did not exaggerate. He did not color the facts with his own anger. He presented it the way he presented everything. Clearly, in sequence, one solid piece laid on top of the last. When he was done, Albury was quiet for several seconds. You're telling me your wife and this man may be planning to kill you, the detective said. Not skeptically, just making sure the words matched. I'm telling you a serious assault has already been committed against my daughter. I'm telling you there's a life insurance policy taken out on me 6 weeks ago that neither I nor my broker were jointly consulted on. I'm telling you the man involved has significant criminal history and documented debts he can't service through legal means. Thomas paused. I want to cooperate fully. Whatever you need. But I want this done right. I don't want a situation where they walk on a technicality. Give me until tomorrow morning, Albury said. I'll pull Rourke's record tonight. Don't change anything. Don't confront her. Maintain your routine. Understood, Thomas said. And Thomas. A pause. You doing okay? I'm fine, Thomas said. He ended the call and set the phone on the nightstand and lay back. Outside the bedroom window, the neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked somewhere 2 streets over. A car passed, headlights crossing the ceiling in a slow arc. The refrigerator hummed from the kitchen. Thomas Weller did not sleep, but he was completely, absolutely calm. 2 days passed. Thomas went to his job site. He came home. He ate. He visited Ava at the hospital and sat with her and talked about ordinary things, her favorite shows, a book she had been reading before all of this, a conversation she'd had with Gwen's daughter on the phone. He behaved precisely the way a man behaved when his world was intact. He was very good at it. He had spent his entire adult life doing the invisible work of steadiness, being the person in the room who did not panic, who did not show the seams, who held the shape of things together because someone had to. Albury called once in those 2 days, briefly. They had pulled Rourke's full record. They were monitoring. There was enough to move on. But moving too early would give Rourke and Nina's attorneys room to argue entrapment by circumstance, the flimsier edges of the insurance evidence, Ava's age, and the defense's ability to challenge her testimony. The DA wanted clean. Thomas understood that. He had waited this long. He could wait a little longer. Keep your phone on, Albury said. Always do, Thomas replied. On the evening of the second day, Nina came into the kitchen while Thomas was making coffee. She moved differently than she had in the days before. Lighter on her feet somehow, slightly looser in the shoulders. The way a person moves when they have arrived at a decision and the uncertainty that preceded it is gone. She leaned against the counter with her hands at her sides. I thought we could drive out to that lake cabin tomorrow night, she said. Granger Lake. I saw it listed somewhere. It's a rental property, quiet, about 40 minutes south. I thought it might be good for us to get out of the house. Talk. Really talk. Without the distraction of everything here. Thomas poured his coffee. He turned and looked at her. He held her gaze for a moment. Long enough to seem like he was considering it. Not long enough to make her feel examined. That sounds good, he said. What time? Something moved across her face so quickly that it was almost nothing. Relief, maybe, or the shadow of relief. After dinner? 7. 7 works, he said. He waited until she had gone to the other room. Then he stepped outside onto the back porch and called Albury. Tomorrow night. Granger Lake, 40 minutes south. There's a cabin on the property. I know the area, Albury said. I'll have people in position before you arrive. Don't be early. Let her set the pace. Under no circumstances engage anyone physically before we're on site. Understood. Thomas. The detective paused. You're certain about this? We can move on what we have. What you have is circumstantial, Thomas said. The policy, the affair, the prior record. It builds a picture, but it doesn't close it. You need them to move. You need an overt act that removes all ambiguity. He set his coffee mug on the porch rail. Let them make the move. I'll be ready. Silence on the line. All right, Albury said. All right. The following evening came in slowly the way October evenings in the Midwest come in. The sky bleeding from gray to a deep, bruised orange at the tree line to the west. The temperature dropping a full 8 degrees in the hour before dark. The air carrying the wet leaf smell of a season turning over. Thomas drove. Nina sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap, looking out the window at the darkening fields. They listened to the radio for the first few miles. Nina turned it off without saying anything, and after that there was only road noise and the sound of the heat running low through the vents. Thomas kept his hands loose on the wheel. He thought about Ava in the hospital bed. He thought about the cast. He thought about the word she had used. He grabbed my arm, and the way she had said it, not dramatically, just plainly, the way a child states a fact that is too large to embellish. He thought about these things in the controlled, deliberate way of a man choosing what to carry with him into a difficult room. He let it sit where it needed to sit. He kept it out of his hands. The turnoff for Granger Lake appeared on the right. A gravel road through old oaks, the trees closing in on both sides, their branches gone bare and skeletal against the last of the light. They followed it for a quarter mile before the cabin came up in the headlights. Low and dark, a single porch light casting a pale wedge down the wooden steps. Light behind the curtains inside. We're here, Nina said. Thomas parked and turned off the engine. He sat for one beat, one slow breath, and then opened the door and stepped out onto the gravel. The night was cold. Still, the lake was invisible beyond the tree line to the west, but he could hear it, a faint, steady lapping against the shore, the slow creak of a dockboard. An owl called once far off in the dark and went quiet. Then the porch light clicked on, and Paul Rourke stepped out through the front door. He stood at the top of the steps with his hands in his jacket pockets, one shoulder against the post, and looked down at Thomas. He was bigger than Thomas remembered from a distance, thick through the chest, heavy in the jaw, the kind of physical size that was meant to communicate something. He looked at Thomas with an expression that moved through surprise and out the other side into something more deliberate. He smirked. You actually came. Thomas stepped away from the car. He did not move toward the porch. He stood on the gravel with his hands loose at his sides and looked at Paul Rourke the way you look at something that has already told you everything you need to know, not with hostility, just with recognition. He heard Nina come around the car, behind him. She stopped a few feet back. He did not look at her. He could feel her presence, the stillness of it, the direction of it. And what struck him most in that moment was not fear or anger or any of the emotions he might have expected. What struck him was how quiet she was. No hesitation, no apology, nothing. Just silence, positioned deliberately behind him. Paul Rourke came down the porch steps one at a time. He moved with the loose confidence of a man who believed he was standing inside the perimeter of something he controlled. He reached the bottom step and stopped, tilted his head to one side, and looked at Thomas with a kind of appraising contempt. You know, he said, for a guy who runs job sites, you took longer to figure this out than I would have expected. Thomas said nothing. Rourke rocked slightly on his heels. You were never supposed to be this hard to deal with. That's the thing about quiet guys. You never know what they're actually carrying. He pulled his hands from his jacket pockets. So what now? You want to have a conversation? I want to hear it from her, Thomas said. He kept his voice flat, Not angry, not cold. Just exact. Rourke glanced over Thomas's shoulder at Nina. Something unspoken passed between them in that glance. A question, a calculation, a brief negotiation conducted entirely without words. Thomas turned his head slightly, not enough to take Rourke fully out of his sight line, but enough to make it clear he was addressing the space behind him. Nina. A long silence. The lake moved in the distance. The trees stood bare and still against the dark sky. And then Nina spoke. Her voice was steady, level. The voice of a person who has rehearsed something and is no longer afraid of delivering it. We needed money, Thomas. Paul is in serious debt. I need it out. I've needed out for a long time. She paused. You were never going to walk away from the house or the accounts without fighting everything in court for years. This was a faster way through. A faster way through, Thomas said quietly. Through my death. She did not answer that directly. The silence was its own confirmation. And when Ava came downstairs and saw you together, Thomas continued, and said she would tell me. Rourke put her in the hospital. Silence. She's 12 years old, Nina. He said it without raising his voice. He said it without any theatrics at all. Just the words precise and level, carrying only the weight that was already in them. She is 12 years old, and she was in that kitchen, and he put his hands on her, and you stood there. And then you told her to lie about it. Nina said nothing. Her jaw moved once. The way a jaw moves when a person is deciding whether there is any useful response to something, and then it stopped. Because there was no response. She knew it, and he knew it. Rourke shifted his weight. He drew a breath. Thomas saw it, the expansion of his chest, the slight opening of his mouth. And then the headlights came. The first pair swept up the gravel road through the trees in a long, hard arc, washing across the cabin and the porch and all three of them in cold white light. Then 2 more pairs. Then the lights were everywhere, from the roadside and from the tree line on the left, and the sound of car doors swinging open cut through the night air like switches thrown one after another. A voice came through a bullhorn, clear, professional, no emotion in it at all. Toledo Police. Do not move. Keep your hands where we can see them. Paul Rourke ran. He pushed off the bottom porch step and drove hard to the left, toward the tree line, the way a man runs who has thought about an escape route, and picked it in advance. He made it approximately 8 feet before 2 officers who had come through the trees from the far side materialized directly in front of him. The collision was brief and loud, Rourke going down hard onto the frozen ground, his shoulder catching a wrong angle, a grunt of pain that carried back clearly through the cold air. Then it was over. Thomas did not watch the rest of it. He turned and looked at Nina. She was standing exactly where she had been, both arms at her sides, her face completely empty. She watched the officers converge. She watched Rourke on the ground. Her jaw moved once. Thomas looked at her and allowed himself, for the last time, a moment of something that might have been grief. Not for what she had planned to do to him. That was beyond grief, beyond any category he had a word for. But for what she had already done. For the years of ordinary life they had built or appeared to build. For Ava's face in that hospital bed, that slight tremble in her lip while she was unconscious, her body still flinching. He looked at Nina standing in the lake dark, in the cold, in the approaching lights of a half-dozen police vehicles. He thought, there is nothing here that can be saved. There is nothing here that I want to save. He turned away. He did not look at her again. He stood near his truck while the scene resolved around him into its separate, functional components. Officers moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times before, organizing, separating, documenting, the whole machinery of consequence operating exactly as it was designed to operate. A detective in plain clothes with a badge on a lanyard came over and asked Thomas a series of questions, and he answered each one honestly and fully and in the same flat, steady voice he had been using all evening. He watched Rourke get walked to a patrol car in handcuffs. Rourke's shoulder was dropped and stiff from the fall, and he moved with the particular careful shuffle of a man trying to keep his body from registering the full extent of what had happened to it. He did not look at Thomas. He looked at the gravel directly in front of his feet, and his face had gone blank in the way that faces go blank when a calculation has run its course and the answer is bad. Nina was walked to a separate car. There was a brief exchange between her and the plainclothes detective. Thomas did not hear the words, only the tone, which was procedural and patient and allowed for no ambiguity about what was happening. Then she was handcuffed and placed in the car. The door closed. The whole thing had been quiet and orderly and nothing at all like anything that happens in movies. Detective Albury found Thomas near the truck. He was a lean, careful-looking man in his mid-50s with a quiet face and the eyes of someone who had seen enough of the world to have stopped being surprised by it. "You okay?" Albury asked. "Yes," Thomas said. The detective looked at him for a moment, reading the answer. "I'll need a formal statement tomorrow morning. The DA is going to want the full chain of documentation. The insurance policy, Ava's account, everything you gave me on the phone. It's going to be thorough. I'll be there whenever you need me. We're looking at attempted murder, assault on a minor, criminal conspiracy." Albury paused. "The insurance piece adds potential federal exposure for fraud. I want you to know this is going to move slowly. The courts are slow. It could be 6 months before trial, possibly more." "I know how long things take," Thomas said. Albury looked at him again, that steady, reading look. Then he nodded and walked back toward the cabin. Thomas stood alone beside his truck. The patrol car lights still turned, washing everything in slow cycles of blue and red. The gravel, the trees, the water just visible at the edge of the property, that flat dark mirror holding the cold sky. He looked at it for a while. He thought about the day they had moved into the Carver Street house, carrying boxes up the porch steps, Nina laughing because the bookshelf was heavier than either of them had expected. He thought about the night Ava was born, that cold February in the hospital, the way the nurse had laid her in Nina's arms and the expression on Nina's face in that moment, real and unguarded and unlike any expression he had seen from her before or since. He thought about the years of ordinary mornings and ordinary weekends and the small daily work of a life built alongside another person. He thought about all of it, and then he got in his truck and drove and left it behind him and did not look back. The months that followed moved with the slow, grinding certainty that only legal processes can produce, depositions and continuances and motions and hearings, and the kind of administrative grinding that takes something that happened in one explosive night and spreads it across a year of paperwork. Thomas attended every meeting he was required to attend. He answered every question he was asked. He gave them the documentation, the screenshots, the timeline, the names, everything he had gathered. His attorney described him as the most cooperative and organized client she had worked with in 15 years of criminal law, which Thomas accepted without comment. He arranged for Ava to stay with his sister Gwen in Sylvania while the legal process ran. Gwen had a house with a yard and a dog and 2 daughters close to Ava's age, and she had opened her door without being asked, the way family sometimes does when things get bad enough. Thomas drove out to see Ava twice a week without exception. He called every evening between 8 and 8:30. No matter what was happening at the job site or in the proceedings. He was never late for the calls. He never canceled. Ava adjusted, in a way children adjust when the adults around them are honest with them and don't treat them as if they need to be protected from the truth. She was quiet for the first few weeks, then less quiet. She went back to school after winter break. She joined the swim team again in the spring. She was 12 going on 40. Thomas thought sometimes, watching her, she had a steadiness in her eyes now that had not been there before, the particular steadiness that comes from discovering that you can survive a thing you expected to break you. He was proud of her in a way that he did not have adequate words for. The trial took place the following spring, on a Tuesday in April. Paul Rourke's public defender made several angles of argument, and none of them held under cross-examination. Nina's private attorney advanced the position that she had been manipulated and controlled by Rourke, that the plan had been his, and she had been swept along by circumstances and by a relationship she could not navigate clearly. The jury listened. They deliberated for 11 hours. Then they returned. The verdicts were read in a courtroom that had the particular institutional silence of a space that had absorbed a great many hard things over many years. Guilty on all counts for both of them. The insurance documentation and the timeline were simply too clear. Ava's testimony, given carefully and without drama from the stand, had been the thing that closed it, 12 years old and precise, looking at the jury and telling them what she had seen and heard in that kitchen, her voice steady the entire time. Nina received 8 years on the conspiracy charge, 3 years concurrent on the fraud count. Rourke received 12, attempted murder, assault on a minor, conspiracy to commit fraud. No deals, no leniency. The judge spoke to Nina before sentencing in a voice that carried no particular heat, but a great deal of deliberateness. He said that the court understood the pressures that led people to desperate decisions. He said that desperation was not exculpatory. He said that the assault on a child was the factor that removed from his consideration any leniency he might otherwise have weighed. Thomas sat in the third row. He listened to the sentences read. He watched the bailiff lead them both out through the side door of the courtroom. He watched until the door closed behind them. He did not look at Nina, not once during the entire proceeding. He walked out of the courthouse into the April air, bright and cold. The smell of rain somewhere off to the west, the buds on the courthouse trees just breaking into their first pale green. He stood on the top step for a moment and tilted his face toward the sky. Then he walked to his truck and drove to Sylvania to pick up Ava. They went to a park near the river that Ava had loved since she was small. A long path along the water, benches set back under old cottonwood trees, a stretch of bank where herons sometimes stood in the shallows in the mornings. The trees were just coming in, that first tentative green that always looked slightly uncertain, like it wasn't sure yet whether the cold was really done. The river was running high and fast from the spring melt, brown and full, moving with purpose. Ava's cast had been off for months. Her arm had healed without complications. She walked beside Thomas with her hands in the front pocket of her sweatshirt and her face turned toward the water, and she was taller than she'd been in October. He noticed that sometimes the way a hard season could pass and your child would be taller on the other side of it, as though growth had been happening the whole time underneath everything else. They sat on a bench. The river moved past them. A heron stood on a flat rock in the shallows downstream, absolutely motionless, watching the water with the total patience of a creature that has evolved to wait. It was today, Ava said. Not a question. She had been waiting to ask. Yes. What did they get? He told her. He gave her the sentences plainly and without softening them, the way he had always told her things. She had earned plainness. She nodded slowly. She looked at the river for a while. Is Mom coming back? No, Thomas said. She sat with that for a moment. The cottonwood leaves turned slowly in the light above them. A pair of mallards worked their way upstream along the far bank, unhurried. Okay, Ava said. She didn't cry. He had wondered, in the weeks and months leading up to this day, whether she would. He understood now that she had already done her crying. In the hospital, in those first weeks at Gwen's house, in whatever private hours she kept to herself that she never described to him. The grief had moved through her and settled somewhere manageable. She was 12 years old. She was already learning to carry things. Thomas understood that. He was doing the same. He had gone back to work after the first week, back to the job sites, back to the honest daily work of building things. He had finished the kitchen renovation in Perrysburg. He had started a bathroom remodel in Mommy and completed it on schedule, which his client noted with visible relief. He had fixed the loose porch step at Gwen's house that had been bothering him every time he visited. He had done his work and made his calls and driven his routes. And slowly, in the way that all things are lived through rather than resolved, the weight of it had found a level. Not light, not gone, manageable. That was enough. He had never written to Nina. He had never visited or called. He had received one letter from her attorney in late November regarding the division of marital assets in the divorce proceedings, and he had forwarded it to his own attorney without reading past the first paragraph. The house on Carver Street would be sold. The accounts would be divided as the court ordered. The paperwork would move through the system and come out the other side resolved, the way paperwork always did, in its own time, indifferent to what any of the people involved were feeling. He thought about Nina sometimes. Not often, and not with the kind of feeling that eats through things and leaves them hollow. He thought about her the way you think about a chapter that has closed, recognizing it as real, as something that happened, without needing to hold it open. She had made choices, a long series of them, one after another, each one a door closing behind her. The affair, the lies, the insurance policy. Standing in that kitchen while Rourke grabbed Ava's arm. Getting into the car at the motel. Standing behind Thomas at the edge of the lake, silent, positioned. At every point, she had been given a door that led somewhere different. At every point, she had chosen the same door. And now she had only the consequences to live in, which were hers and no one else's. Thomas did not find that satisfying in any dramatic sense. It was simply what it was. The world worked the way the world worked. Structures held, or they failed based on whether they were built correctly, and no amount of wanting them to hold changed the physics. He had spent his whole career understanding that. He understood it now. He sat on the bench beside his daughter in the April afternoon, watching the heron in the shallows. It stood perfectly still for a long time, its attention fixed on the moving water, absolutely unhurried. Then it struck, fast, precise, a single motion, and came up with something in its beak, and stood again and swallowed, and went still once more. Patient, certain, waiting for the right moment, and then not hesitating when it came. He thought that was about as good a model as any. Ava put her head against his shoulder. He let her. The river kept moving. The trees turned their new green in the light. The afternoon stretched forward into the easy, undecorated shape of a day when nothing needs to happen, when you're simply allowed to be somewhere with someone you love, and that is sufficient. Thomas Weller had been a man of patience long before any of this began. He had built that patience the same way he had built everything else in his life. Slowly, with attention, without shortcuts. It had cost him something over the years, that quality. It had made him easy to underestimate. It had made him easy for the wrong person to plan around. What they had not understood, what Nina and Paul Rourke had both fundamentally failed to account for, was that patience is not the same as passivity, is not the same as not seeing, is not the same as forgiveness or weakness or an inability to move. Patience is simply the willingness to wait until you know exactly what needs to happen. And Thomas Weller had always known, when the time came, exactly what needed to happen. He sat still. The river moved. His daughter breathed beside him. And the day went on.